The sun beamed down on the backyard, transforming it into a vibrant playground adorned with balloons and streamers. Children's laughter filled the air, mingling with the upbeat music. In the midst of it all, Sandra watched her son, Ethan, celebrate his first birthday, his face alight with pure, uninhibited joy. "Look at him, Anthony! Can you believe he's already won?" Sandra's voice was a mixture of awe and nostalgia as she glanced at her husband. Anthony, standing a little apart, forced a smile. "Yeah, time flies," he replied, his voice lacking its usual warmth. His eyes, shadowed with unspoken thoughts, briefly met hers before drifting away. Sandra felt a twinge of concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Of course, just tired from work." Anthony quickly masked his expression, turning to look at Ethan, who was now gleefully attempting to eat a balloon. The afternoon wore on, with games and laughter. Sandra, ever the gracious host, flitted among the guests, her laughter a bit too loud, her smiles a bit too bright. Anthony watched her from a distance, his mind swirling with doubt. "Why does she keep checking her phone?" he muttered to himself, observing Sandra as she discreetly glanced at her phone every few minutes. "Hey, Anthony, you've been quite the observer today. Something on your mind?" Mark, Anthony's close friend, approached him with a beer in hand. "Just thinking," Anthony replied, his gaze still fixed on Sandra. Mark followed his gaze, then said gently, "Man, if there's something bothering you..." Anthony shook his head. "It's nothing, just work stuff." As the party drew to a close, Anthony's mind was a tumult of suspicion and confusion. Sandra's phone behavior, her forced cheerfulness, something didn't add up. He watched as she hugged their son, her laughter genuine and bright for a moment, and he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite place. That night, as Ethan slept and the house lay quiet, Anthony lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Sandra's soft breathing beside him felt distant, as if a chasm had opened up between them. His mind replayed the day's events, each smile, each glance, and each word she spoke. The seeds of doubt, once planted, were now taking root, growing into a gnawing suspicion that would soon drive him to seek the truth, whatever it might be. Days after Ethan's birthday, the air in the house felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Anthony found himself watching Sandra more closely, his suspicions quietly gnawing at him. One evening, as Sandra stepped into the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Anthony glanced at it, a battle waging within him. Finally, curiosity overpowered his reservations. He picked up her phone, his fingers hesitating before swiping it open. He quickly navigated to her location history, a sense of betrayal accompanying each tap. The screen displayed a list of locations, many familiar, but a few stood out, places Sandra had never mentioned visiting. Anthony's heart sank with each new discovery. "Where were you last Thursday?" Anthony found himself asking later that night as they sat in the living room. "At my sister's, remember?" "I told you," Sandra replied, looking up from her book. Anthony nodded, though her answer contradicted the location history he had seen. "Right, of course." Days passed, and Anthony's internal turmoil grew. He began to look for more evidence, each action feeling like a betrayal, yet driven by an insatiable need to know the truth. One evening, Sandra caught him in his search. "Anthony, what are you doing with my phone?" she asked, her voice laced with surprise and concern. "Just looking for the pizza place's number. Thought I'd save it to mine," Anthony stammered, feeling the weight of her gaze. Sandra seemed to accept this explanation, but Anthony noticed a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it suspicion? Guilt? As Sandra returned to her activities, Anthony's mind raced. Her reactions, her answers, the discrepancies in her stories. Everything pointed to something she was hiding. But what? And why? That night, as they lay in bed, the distance between them felt like miles. Sandra's gentle breathing was a stark contrast to Anthony's restless mind. He realized then that the evidence he gathered was not just about her deceit, but also about the erosion of trust in their relationship. The man who once shared his deepest fears and dreams with Sandra now lay beside her, drowning in a sea of doubt and unanswered questions. As days turned into weeks, the once warm and loving atmosphere in Anthony and Sandra's home had subtly shifted. Anthony's suspicions cast a shadow over their interactions, and Sandra, oblivious to the specifics of his turmoil, sensed. One evening, Sandra poured herself a glass of wine, the third for that night. Anthony observed her from across the room, noting the gradual change in her behavior as the wine took effect. Her laughter was louder, her movements more carefree, yet there was a coldness in her eyes when she looked at him. "Another glass, Sandra." Anthony's voice carried a hint of disapproval. "Just unwinding from the day," Sandra replied, her tone sharp. "Is there a problem with—" "No problem. Just an observation," Anthony said, his words careful, lazy. The conversation lapsed into an uncomfortable silence. Anthony watched as Sandra's gaze often drifted to her phone, her fingers tapping an anxious rhythm on the table. It was a small thing, but to Anthony, it was another piece in the puzzling behavior he couldn't quite understand. At a dinner party the following week, Anthony's observations continued. He watched as Sandra interacted with their friends, her behavior slightly off. She laughed a bit too hard at jokes, her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes, and she seemed preoccupied, her thoughts elsewhere. "Is everything okay with you two?" Their friend Lisa whispered to Anthony, her concern evident. "We're fine, just the usual stress of work and home," Anthony replied, masking his. As the party wore on, Sandra's behavior became increasingly erratic. She drank more than usual and her conversations seemed forced. Anthony's gaze was drawn to her repeatedly, a mixture of concern and suspicion coloring his observation. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Anthony couldn't hold back his thoughts any longer. "Sandra, you've been different lately. Is there something going on?" Anthony asked, his voice. Sandra looked at him, a flash of something crossing her face before she masked it with a tired smile. "It's nothing, Anthony. Just work stress, I guess." Anthony wanted to believe her, to accept her explanation at face value, but the seeds of doubt planted in his mind refused to let him. The man who once knew Sandra's every mood and thought now found himself questioning everything she said, every smile, every glance. The tension between them was a living thing, growing with each day, fed by unspoken suspicions and silent observations. Easter arrived with its promise of renewal, but in Anthony and Sandra's home, the atmosphere was anything but rejuvenating. Anthony found himself increasingly consumed by his suspicions, desperate for solid evidence. That Sunday, Sandra and Ethan went to her sister's house for an Easter brunch, while Anthony excused himself, citing an urgent work issue. As soon as they left, Anthony began his search. It felt like an invasion, a betrayal of the trust and love they once shared, but his need for the truth was overwhelming. He rifled through drawers, checked pockets of Sandra's coats, and even looked under the bed for any clue, any piece of evidence. His heart raced, half in fear of what he might find, and half in fear of finding nothing at all. In the midst of his search, he heard a noise at the front door. Panicking, he rushed to tidy up, just as Sandra walked in, Ethan in tow. "Why are you home so early? Is everything okay?" Sandra asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Yeah, the issue got resolved quicker than I thought," Anthony replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Sandra seemed to accept this, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. "Well, that's good then. Ethan missed you at the brunch." Anthony forced a smile and played with Ethan, trying to push away the guilt and frustration he felt from his fruitless search. Later that evening, while Sandra was putting Ethan to bed, Anthony went to the kitchen. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. His eyes landed on the trash can. He remembered Sandra mentioning they had stopped for Taco Bell on their way back. A desperate idea took hold of him, and he began sifting through the trash, looking for any evidence of the fast food stop. His search yielded nothing but scraps of everyday life, no Taco Bell wrappers, no unexpected receipts. He stood there amidst the discarded remnants of their daily life, feeling both relieved and lost. The lack of evidence should have been comforting, yet it only deepened the mystery, leaving him with more questions than answers. That night, as they lay in bed, Sandra turned to him, her voice soft in the darkness. "Anthony, you've been so distant lately. Is there something wrong?" Anthony lay still, torn between his love for her and the chasm of doubt that had opened up between them. "It's nothing. Just work stress," he lied, hating himself for it. Sandra seemed to accept his answer, but the distance between them remained, a silent witness to the growing divide in their once happy home. Anthony's quest for the truth had led him to a dead end, leaving him with an aching heart and a mind full of... The weight of unspoken suspicions had become unbearable for Anthony. One night, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, he knew it was time to confront Sandra. The air was heavy with tension, a silent prelude to the storm that was about to unfold. "Sandra, we need to talk," Anthony began, his voice steady, but laced with an undercurrent of emotion. Sandra looked up from her book, her expression one of mild surprise. "What's wrong, Anthony?" "It's about you. I've noticed things that don't add up," Anthony said, struggling to keep his voice even. Sandra's face tightened slightly, a hint of apprehension in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Anthony took a deep breath. "Why have you been lying to me, Sandra? Your phone, your whereabouts? There's something you're not telling me." For a moment, Sandra was silent, her face a mask of confusion. Lying. "Anthony, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me, Sandra. I've seen your phone's location history. Places you said you never went to." Anthony's voice rose, a mixture of anger and pain. Sandra's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "You went through my phone." "Yes, I did. Because you've been acting so secretive. What are you hiding, Sandra?" Anthony's accusation hung heavily in the air. Sandra looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. After a long, tense silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I haven't been entirely honest with you." Anthony felt his heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" I kissed Donald, my co-worker, at the office party last month. It was a stupid mistake," Sandra's voice broke, laden with guilt. Anthony felt as if the ground had slipped from under him. "A kiss?" "Yes, nothing more. I swear, Anthony." It was a moment of weakness, and I regret it. Sandra's eyes met his, pleading for understanding. Anthony sat back, the revelation hitting him like a tidal wave. His mind raced, trying to process her words. Part of him wanted to believe that was the whole truth, yet the seed of doubt planted deep in his heart whispered otherwise. "Is there more to it? Is this why you've been so distant?" Anthony's questions were a mix of, "No, Anthony. It was just that one mistake." "I promise." Sandra's voice was earnest, her eyes searching his for forgiveness. The room fell silent, the air thick with a mix of relief and lingering suspicion. Anthony was torn between the love he had for his wife and the betrayal he felt. He wanted to believe her, to accept her partial admission and move on, but a part of him feared that there was more to the story, secrets still hidden in the shadows of their strained relationship. The days following the confrontation were a blur of strained conversations and awkward silences. The revelation of Sandra's kiss with Donald had shaken the very foundation of their marriage, leaving Anthony to grapple with a maelstrom of emotions. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, the air thick with unspoken words, Sandra reached out a tentative hand across the table. "Anthony, I am so sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I am." Anthony looked at her, his eyes a mix of hurt and confusion. "I just don't understand, Sandra. Why him? Why did you do it? It was a moment of sheer stupidity. I felt overwhelmed with work and home, and he was there. It meant nothing. Anthony, Sandra's voice quivered with emotion. Anthony shook his head slowly, his heart heavy. I want to believe you, Sandra. I do. But how can I be sure there isn't more you're not telling me? How do I trust you again? Sandra's eyes filled with tears. I'll do anything, Anthony. I can quit my job. We can go to counselling. I just don't want to lose you. Anthony sighed, a deep, weary sound. I don't know if that's enough. I keep thinking about it, about you with him. It's like this constant loop in my... Sandra reached across the table again, her hand trembling. Please, let's try to work through this. For us, for Ethan. Anthony pulled away gently. I need time, Sandra. Time to think, to figure out if I can move past this. The following weeks were filled with uncertainty. Anthony watched Sandra as she tried to mend the rift between them. She offered to quit her job, suggested counselling, and tried to be more open, but the shadow of her betrayal lingered. One night, lying awake in bed, Anthony turned to Sandra. I keep asking myself, will it always be like this? Will I always be wondering if you're lying, if there's someone else? Sandra, her voice soft and strained, replied, I hope not. I hope with time you can forgive me. I love you, Anthony, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. Anthony lay there, staring at the ceiling, the future of their marriage, an uncharted territory. The trust they once shared had been shattered, and the path to rebuilding it was daunting and uncertain. He loved Sandra, but the pain of her betrayal was a constant companion, casting a long shadow over their attempts to heal. As he drifted off to sleep, Anthony wondered if their love could survive this. Could they rebuild their relationship on the broken pieces of trust? Or was this the beginning of the end? The answers seemed as elusive as the sleep that finally claimed him. Months had passed since Sandra's confession. The seasons changed, but the chill in Anthony and Sandra's home persisted, a silent testament to the unresolved turmoil in their hearts. One quiet evening, as they sat in the living room, each lost in their thoughts, Anthony broke the silence. Do you ever think about how things used to be, Sandra? His voice was soft, tinged with a sadness that had become all too familiar. Sandra looked up, her eyes reflecting the pain that had become a constant companion. Oh! Every day, Anthony. I miss us. Anthony nodded, a deep sigh escaping him. I miss that too, but I can't get past what happened. It's like this wall between us that just keeps getting higher. Sandra moved closer to him, her expression earnest. I know I broke us, Anthony, and I would give anything to go back and change what I did, but I can't. All I can do is try to rebuild, piece by piece. Anthony turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. But how do we do that, Sandra? How do we start over when every time I look at you, I'm reminded of what happened? Sandra reached for his hand, holding it gently. We start by forgiving. Not forgetting, but forgiving. And then we build on that day by day. We talk, we listen, we try to understand each other again. Anthony's grip on her hand tightened slightly. I want to believe we can get past this. For our sake, for Ethan's. But I'm scared, Sandra. Scared that we'll never find our way back to each other. Sandra squeezed his hand in return, her voice a whisper. I'm scared too, but I believe in us, Anthony. I believe in the love we had and the love we can have again. It won't be easy, but I'm willing to fight for it for you, for our family. The room fell silent again, the weight of their words hanging in the air. They sat there, hand in hand, each lost in their thoughts, yet together in their solitude. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and the daunting task of mending a... Yet, in that moment of shared vulnerability, a faint glimmer of hope flickered, suggesting that perhaps through the pain and the heartache, a new, stronger bond could be forged. As the night deepened, Anthony and Sandra remained together, the silence around them no longer oppressive, but a canvas on which they could slowly start to repaint their future, one hesitant stroke at a time. Dear listeners, do you think a kiss is a betrayal? And if one of the partners stumbles in the relationship, is it worth forgiving?